The coffee had gone cold in my hands, but I didn't notice. I was too busy watching my son Marcus pace the hospital corridor like a caged animal, his designer shoes clicking against the polished floor with each frustrated turn. 3 days since little Emma was born. 3 days since the doctors delivered news that would change everything. Cystic fibrosis, they'd said, the words hanging in the antiseptic air like a death sentence. It's manageable with proper care, but it's lifelong. I'd seen Marcus handle business crises before, watched him negotiate million-dollar deals with the same cold calculation he'd inherited from his father. But this had shattered something inside him that I didn't even know existed. "She's going to be fine," I whispered to Sarah, my daughter-in-law, as she held Emma against her chest. The baby was so small, so perfect, her tiny fingers curled around the edge of her pink blanket. The doctors said with treatment. Marcus stopped pacing and turned to face us, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Do you know what that means, Mom? Daily medications, hospital visits, physical therapy, special schools, a lifetime of being different." Sarah's arms tightened around the baby, and I saw something flicker across her face. Fear, but not of the diagnosis. Fear of him. "Marcus, please," she said softly. "She's our daughter. We'll handle whatever comes." "Handle it?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Sarah, I had plans. We had plans. This isn't what I signed up for when I agreed to have children." The words hit me like ice water. Agreed to have children. As if Emma was a business contract he could renegotiate. I stood up slowly, my arthritis protesting after hours in that uncomfortable plastic chair. "What exactly are you saying, son?" He ran his hands through his hair, the same gesture he'd made as a boy when caught in a lie. "I'm saying this changes everything. Everything we worked for, everything we built. She's going to need constant care, constant attention. Sarah won't be able to work. I'll be supporting 3 people instead of 2, and one of them will never be independent." The baby made a small sound, and Sarah's eyes filled with tears she was trying so hard not to let fall. I wanted to reach over and take Emma from her arms, to shield that innocent child from the poison filling this sterile room. "She's 3 days old," I said, my voice steady despite the storm building in my chest. "She hasn't even been home yet, and maybe that's for the best." The words came out quietly, almost under his breath, but we all heard them. Sarah gasped. "Marcus, what are you saying?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, he pulled out his phone and started typing furiously. "I'm calling my lawyer. There are options, programs, facilities that specialize in this kind of thing." "Facilities?" I couldn't keep the shock from my voice. "She's your daughter, not a problem to be solved." "Is she?" Marcus looked up from his phone, and for a moment, I didn't recognize the man standing before me. This cold, calculating stranger wearing my son's face. Because right now, it feels like she's a 20-year burden disguised as a blessing. That's when I saw it. The exact expression that used to cross his father's face when Marcus was young and struggling in school. When the learning disability made homework a nightly battle. When other kids called him stupid, and David would get that same look of disappointment, as if Marcus's challenges were somehow a reflection on him personally. I'd protected Marcus from that judgment then, made excuses for David's distance, told myself he just didn't know how to handle difficulty. But I'd been lying to myself for years about what kind of man my husband really was. And now I was watching that same coldness emerge in my son, directed at the most vulnerable member of our family. Sarah was crying openly now, soft sobs that shook her shoulders while she pressed her face against Emma's head. The baby, sensing her mother's distress, began to fuss. "Give her to me," I said, reaching for Emma. "Mom, don't," Marcus started. "Give me my granddaughter." My voice carried a firmness that surprised even me. Sarah looked up gratefully and carefully transferred the baby to my arms. Emma settled immediately, her tiny body relaxing against my chest. She was warm and solid and perfect, and holding her reminded me of something I'd forgotten during 35 years of walking on eggshells around difficult men. "She's beautiful," I whispered, looking down at her peaceful face. "And she's loved." Marcus made a sound of frustration. "This isn't about love, Mom. This is about reality, about practical decisions and long-term planning, and about becoming the kind of man your father was." The words were out before I could stop them. The corridor went silent. Even the sounds from the nurse's station seemed to fade away. Marcus stared at me with something between shock and fury. What's that supposed to mean? I looked at this man I'd raised, This person I'd tried so hard to teach kindness and compassion, and realized I'd failed him in the most fundamental way. I'd let him grow up thinking love was conditional, that children had to earn their parents' acceptance by being easy, by being perfect, by never needing more than their parents were comfortable giving. It means, I said quietly, still holding Emma close, that you're standing in a hospital room talking about abandoning your 3-day-old daughter because she isn't convenient for your plans, just like your father wanted to abandon you when school got hard. If you like emotional stories that touch the heart, please subscribe. We're trying to reach 1,000 friends here on this journey. And tell me, from which city are you watching? Your support means everything. Sarah looked between us with wide eyes, clearly sensing undercurrents she didn't fully understand. Marcus's face had gone pale. He started. You never knew because I protected you from it, I interrupted. I made excuses, smoothed things over, convinced myself he just needed time to adjust. But you know what, Marcus? Time doesn't make selfish men caring. It just makes them better at hiding their selfishness. Emma stirred in my arms, and I adjusted her blanket with the automatic motions of someone who'd done this before, who'd held her father the same way 35 years ago, promising him silently that he'd always be loved, always be wanted, always be enough, exactly as he was. This baby, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word, is not a burden. She's not a mistake. She's not a problem to be solved or a disappointment to be hidden away. She's your daughter, and she deserves better than a father who sees her diagnosis before he sees her heart. Marcus turned away, but not before I caught the flash of pain in his eyes. Good. Maybe that meant there was still hope for him. Maybe the man I'd tried to raise was still in there somewhere, buried under layers of his father's influence and society's expectations about success and perfection. But as I held my granddaughter and watched my son struggle with feelings he'd never learned to process in healthy ways, I realized something that chilled me to the bone. Protecting Emma was going to require more than love and good intentions. It was going to require me to finally do what I should have done 35 years ago. It was going to require me to be the kind of mother and grandmother who puts children's needs before adults' comfort, even if that adult was my own son. 2 weeks later, I sat in Sarah's living room watching my son pretend to be a father. He held Emma like she might break, not with the tender care of a protective parent, but with the awkward distance of someone handling something unpleasant that couldn't be avoided. She needs her medication in an hour, Sarah said from the kitchen, where she was preparing Emma's specialized formula. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd been doing everything alone. Marcus nodded without looking up from his phone. Marcus, did you hear me? I heard you. His thumb scrolled through emails with practiced indifference. Medication. 1 hour. I watched Sarah's shoulders slump as she turned back to measuring powder and warm water with the precision of a chemist. Every bottle feeding required careful calculation, the right nutrients, the right enzymes, the right timing. It was a ballet of medical necessity that she'd mastered in 14 days, while my son mastered the art of being present but absent. Let me help, I said, standing up. Oh, you don't need to, Sarah started. I want to. I moved beside her at the counter, noting how her hands trembled slightly as she mixed the formula. You've been doing this alone too much. She glanced toward the living room where Marcus sat, still absorbed in his digital world. He's adjusting, she whispered, but even she didn't sound convinced. Is he? Before she could answer, Emma began to fuss. The sound that should have triggered immediate parental response barely registered with Marcus. He glanced up briefly, then returned to his phone as if the baby crying was background noise he'd learned to filter out. Sarah moved quickly toward the living room, but I caught her arm gently. Let him, I said quietly. Let him hear his daughter. We stood there in the kitchen doorway, watching. Emma's cries grew more insistent, that particular newborn sound that cuts straight through any parent's heart, or should. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening with annoyance. Sarah, he called, never taking his eyes off his screen. She's crying. I know. Sarah's voice was steady, but I could see the battle between her protective instincts and her growing resentment. Can you pick her up? You're better at it. 5 words that said everything about where this marriage was heading. 5 words that reduced Sarah to a nursemaid and Marcus to a visitor in his own child's life. I watched my daughter-in-law's face crumble slightly before she composed herself and moved to take Emma, But the damage was done. Another small crack in the foundation of trust that should support a family. Actually, I said, stepping forward, I'd like to hold her. Sarah looked grateful as she passed Emma to me. The baby settled immediately, her tiny fist gripping my finger with surprising strength. Marcus finally looked up, and something flickered across his face. Was it jealousy that his daughter found comfort so easily with everyone except him? She likes you, Sarah said with a tired smile. Babies know love when they feel it, I replied, but my eyes were on Marcus. He was watching us with an expression I couldn't quite read. Resentment? Confusion? The lost look of a man who'd expected fatherhood to feel different than this? His phone buzzed, and his attention snapped back to the screen immediately. I have to take this call. Client emergency. It's Sunday, Sarah said quietly. Investment emergencies don't follow calendars. He was already walking toward his home office, the phone pressed to his ear. Johnson? Yeah, I saw the reports. His voice faded as he disappeared down the hallway, leaving Sarah and me alone with Emma. The silence stretched between us, filled with all the things Sarah wasn't saying about her husband's increasing absences, his emotional withdrawal, his growing list of client emergencies that always seemed to coincide with feeding times and diaper changes. He's working extra hard right now, Sarah said, as if testing the words to see if they sounded believable. The medical bills are going to be expensive, so he's taking on more clients. I nodded, but we both knew that wasn't the whole truth. Marcus had always been ambitious, but this was different. This was escape disguised as responsibility. How are you sleeping? I asked, because someone needed to be concerned about the woman who was carrying the weight of everything alone. I'm fine, Sarah. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw the cracks she'd been hiding. 3 hours at a time if I'm lucky. Emma needs her chest therapy every 4 hours, even overnight. The feeding schedule is complicated, and with Marcus working so much, she trailed off, unwilling to voice what we both knew. You need help. I can handle it. Of course you can, but you shouldn't have to. Emma made a small sound, and Sarah's attention immediately focused on the baby with the hypervigilance of a mother who'd learned that every sound, every change, might be medically significant. Has she been gaining weight? I asked, slowly. The doctor says it's normal for CF babies to struggle with weight gain, but every ounce matters. Sarah's voice carried the weight of constant monitoring, of turning motherhood into a medical mission where failure wasn't an option. From his office, we could hear Marcus's voice rising with professional authority. No, that's not acceptable. We discussed the parameters clearly. He was confident there, in control, commanding respect and getting results. Everything that fatherhood wasn't providing him. Do you have help during the day? I asked. My mom comes when she can, but she's watching my sister's kids too since the divorce. Sarah adjusted Emma's blanket with unnecessary precision, and Marcus suggested I not go back to work yet. He says it's better if I focus on Emma full-time. The way she said suggested told me it hadn't been a suggestion at all. Another decision made for her. Another choice taken away in the name of what was better for everyone except the woman actually doing the work. What did you do before Emma? I was a graphic designer, freelance mostly, but I had some steady clients. Her eyes brightened slightly at the memory. I was actually building up to start my own agency. You could still do that. Not now. Emma needs... She gestured vaguely at the medical supplies lined up on the coffee table like a pharmacy display. This is my job now. I heard the resignation in her voice, the acceptance of a future she'd never chosen, but was learning to navigate. And I heard something else, the slow death of dreams deferred indefinitely. Marcus appeared in the doorway, sliding his phone into his pocket with the satisfied expression of someone who'd solved another crisis through sheer force of will. Everything handled? Sarah asked. For now. He looked at Emma in my arms, and for a moment, something almost paternal crossed his face. How's she doing? She's perfect, I said, meaning it. The medication? I gave it to her 20 minutes ago, Sarah interrupted quietly. While you were on your call. He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. Right, good. An awkward silence settled over the room. This should have been a peaceful family moment, 3 generations sharing Sunday afternoon together. Instead, it felt like 3 people trapped in separate bubbles, connected by obligation but divided by unspoken resentments and expectations. None of them knew how to meet. I should get going, Marcus said, checking his watch. I have a conference call with Tokyo in an hour. On Sunday night? Sarah's voice was carefully neutral. International markets don't sleep. He leaned down and kissed Sarah's forehead with perfunctory affection, then looked at Emma in my arms. For a moment, I thought he might reach for her, might try to connect with this tiny person who shared his DNA but remained a stranger to him. Instead, he straightened up. "Tell her Daddy said goodnight. Tell her." As if Emma was already too distant, too other, for direct communication. After he left, Sarah and I sat in the growing darkness, neither of us reaching for the light switch. Emma dozed in my arms, her breathing steady and strong despite everything working against her. "It's going to get better," Sarah said suddenly, as if she'd been rehearsing the words. "Once we get into a routine, once Emma's condition stabilizes, once Marcus adjusts to everything, it has to get better." I wanted to agree with her. I wanted to believe that love would eventually triumph over fear, that parenthood would awaken something in my son that business success never had. But I'd spent 35 years watching my husband choose convenience over connection, watching him justify emotional distance as practical necessity. I'd seen how easily good men could become bystanders in their own families' lives. And as I held my granddaughter and watched her mother struggle to convince herself that abandonment was just temporary adjustment, I realized something that made my chest tight with familiar pain. History wasn't just repeating itself. It was accelerating. I started visiting every other day, telling myself it was to help with Emma, but knowing the truth was more complicated. I was watching, waiting, hoping Marcus would find his way to fatherhood before Sarah broke completely under the weight of doing it alone. On Tuesday, I brought homemade soup, the kind that simmers all day and fills a house with comfort. Sarah answered the door in yesterday's clothes, her hair pulled back in a messy bun that spoke of efficiency over appearance. "You didn't have to," she started. "I wanted to." I stepped inside, noting how the living room had transformed into a medical command center. Nebulizer equipment on the coffee table, medications lined up like tiny soldiers on the mantel, charts tracking Emma's weight, feeding times, and symptoms taped to the refrigerator with mathematical precision. Emma was in her bouncy seat, awake and alert, her bright eyes following movements around the room. At 6 weeks old, she was already showing personality. The way she gripped toys with determination, how she studied faces with serious concentration, the tiny smile that appeared when she heard familiar voices. "She's gorgeous," I said, settling beside her. "Look at those eyes. Marcus says she looks like his mother." Sarah's voice carried a strain I was learning to recognize. "He keeps pointing out features that remind him of her, his mother. My late mother-in-law, who'd died when Marcus was 12 and who'd become, in family mythology, the perfect woman no one could live up to. David had spent years comparing every woman in Marcus's life to that idealized memory, and apparently, the tradition was continuing into the next generation. "She looks like herself," I said firmly, "and she's beautiful." Sarah managed a real smile then, the first I'd seen in weeks. "The pediatrician says she's doing well. Her lung function is better than expected for a CF baby." "That's wonderful news. I've been doing the chest therapy religiously, 4 times a day, exactly as prescribed, and the nutritional supplements are helping with weight gain." Pride crept into Sarah's voice, the satisfaction of a mother who was fighting for her child's health and winning small victories through sheer determination. "You're doing an amazing job. I just wish—" She trailed off, glancing toward Marcus's home office where we could hear him on another conference call. "What do you wish?" "I wish he could see her the way you do, the way I do." Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "Sometimes I catch him looking at her and it's like he's calculating something, like he's adding up costs versus benefits." Before I could respond, Marcus emerged from his office, phone still pressed to his ear. He nodded at me briefly, then continued his conversation while moving toward the kitchen. "No, the Hong Kong deal closes Thursday. We need those documents signed and witnessed by—" His voice faded as he rifled through papers on the counter. I watched him search for something, his movements sharp with impatience. Finally, he hung up and looked around the room with the frustrated expression of someone who couldn't find what he needed. "Sarah, where's the folder from Peterson's office? The blue one with the contracts?" "I think it's in your briefcase," Sarah said, adjusting Emma's blanket. "In the car, maybe?" I checked there. His tone carried the edge of someone whose time was being wasted by other people's inefficiency. "It was on the counter this morning." I watched Sarah's face change, saw the automatic assumption of responsibility even when she'd been caring for Emma all morning while he worked behind closed doors. "Let me look," she said, starting to get up. "I'll find it." I stood instead, moving toward the kitchen where papers were scattered across the counter in the disorganized way of someone juggling too many priorities. "It's not your responsibility, Mom," Marcus said, but he didn't stop me from looking. I found the folder underneath a stack of Emma's medical records. Ironically, the very documents that tracked his daughter's progress while he searched for business papers. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. "Here," I said, handing him the folder. "Thanks." He took it without meeting my eyes, already scanning the contents. "Sarah, I'm going to be late tonight. The Peterson meeting moved to 7, and then I have dinner with the Singapore team." "That's 3 nights this week," Sarah said quietly. "I know, but this deal alone will cover Emma's medical expenses for the next year." He said it as if that justified everything, as if providing money was equivalent to providing presents. "What about her breathing treatment at 8? You said you wanted to learn how to do it." Marcus looked up from his papers, and I saw something flicker across his face. Guilt, maybe, or irritation at being reminded of promises he'd apparently forgotten. "Can't you handle it tonight? I'll learn tomorrow." "You said that yesterday." "Sarah, I'm doing this for our family." His voice carried the patient tone of someone explaining obvious truths to someone too emotional to understand them. "Emma's going to need specialists, equipment, medications for the rest of her life. That money doesn't appear magically." "I know that, but what? You want me to turn down career opportunities so I can watch you give our daughter chest therapy? You're perfectly capable of handling her medical care. That's what mothers do." The words hung in the air like a slap. That's what mothers do. As if fatherhood was optional when children became inconvenient or medically complex. I felt something hot rise in my chest, but before I could speak, Sarah's voice cut through the tension. "And what do fathers do, Marcus?" He looked genuinely surprised by the question, as if the answer was so obvious it hardly needed stating. "Fathers provide. Fathers make sure their families have what they need to survive and thrive. Fathers make the hard choices and sacrifices so everyone else can have security." He gestured toward Emma in her bouncy seat. "That's exactly what I'm doing. She needs you, not just your paycheck. She needs medical care that costs more than most people make in a year. She needs a future that doesn't depend on hoping insurance will cover experimental treatments. She needs a father who's realistic about what it takes to raise a special needs child in this world." Special needs. He said it like a diagnosis he was still learning to accept, a category that placed Emma somewhere outside the realm of normal parental expectations. "She needs a father who can hold her without looking like it's a chore," I said quietly. The room went silent. Even Emma seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, her bright eyes moving between the adults whose voices had taken on edges she was too young to understand, but old enough to feel. Marcus turned to look at me fully for the first time since he'd arrived. "Excuse me? You heard what I said. I don't think you understand the pressure I'm under right now, the financial reality of this situation. I understand that you're using work as an excuse to avoid bonding with your daughter because she's not the easy, healthy baby you ordered." Sarah's intake of breath was audible. Marcus's face flushed with anger, but beneath it, I saw something else. The flash of recognition that comes when someone speaks a truth you've been avoiding. "That's completely unfair, is it? When was the last time you fed her? Changed her diaper? Did her breathing treatment? When was the last time you held her just because you wanted to, not because Sarah handed her to you? I'm working 16-hour days to avoid learning that she's just a baby who needs her daddy." I moved closer to Emma's bouncy seat, resting my hand gently on the edge. "She doesn't know she's supposed to be expensive or complicated. She only knows whether the people around her respond to her with love or resentment." Marcus stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him processing whether to defend himself or attack my right to judge his parenting. Finally, he chose a third option. He laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh exactly, but it was dismissive. The laugh of someone who'd decided the other person was being naive about realities they couldn't possibly understand. "Mom, with all due respect, you raised your children in a different era, when medical bills didn't bankrupt families and special needs kids had lower expectations for their futures. This isn't the 1980s anymore." "You're right," I said calmly. "In the 1980s, I let your father convince me that emotional distance was practical necessity. I let him treat you like a burden when school got hard instead of the child who needed extra support. I made excuses for his absence instead of demanding his presence." Marcus's laugh faded. "So, yes, this is a different era, which means you get to choose whether to repeat those mistakes or do better, whether to be the father you needed or the father you had." Sarah was watching this exchange with wide eyes, probably wondering if she should intervene or hide. Emma made a small sound, not crying, just the soft vocalization of a baby who was content and alert and completely unaware that her very existence was being debated by the adults who were supposed to protect her unconditionally. Marcus looked at his daughter for a long moment, and I held my breath, hoping this might be the moment when something shifted inside him. Instead, he picked up his briefcase and headed toward the door. I have to go. We'll continue this conversation when I get home tonight. Marcus, Sarah started. Sarah, you're doing great with her. Better than I would anyway. Some people are naturals at this stuff, and some people need to focus on what they're actually good at. He left without kissing either of them goodbye. In the silence that followed, Emma began to fuss. Sarah moved to pick her up, but her hands were shaking so badly that I reached for the baby instead. He's wrong, I whispered, holding Emma close while Sarah finally let herself cry. He's scared and he's wrong. And he's going to lose the most important thing he'll ever have the chance to love. But as I rocked my granddaughter and watched my daughter-in-law fall apart, I realized something that made my blood run cold. Marcus wasn't just walking away from his responsibilities. He was walking away from his child, and unless something changed soon, this withdrawal was going to become permanent. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of careful distance and growing silence. I still visited, but something fundamental had shifted after that confrontation in Sarah's kitchen. Marcus was polite when our paths crossed, the kind of surface civility that felt more insulting than open hostility. He'd started timing his arrivals and departures to minimize overlap with my visits. When we did encounter each other, he'd nod and make small talk about the weather or ask generic questions about my health, as if I were a neighbor he was obligated to acknowledge rather than the woman who'd raised him. "How are you feeling, Mom?" he'd ask while scrolling through his phone. "I'm fine, Marcus." Good. That's good." And then he'd disappear into his office or find urgent errands that required immediate attention. The man who used to call me twice a week to discuss everything from work stress to restaurant recommendations had become a polite stranger living in the same emotional zip code as his sick daughter. Sarah tried to bridge the gap between us, offering updates about Marcus's work schedule or explaining his absence with increasingly creative justifications. "He's been staying at the downtown office more often," she said one afternoon while Emma dozed in her arms. "The commute is easier for his early morning calls." We both knew he had a perfectly functional home office. We both knew his early morning calls had been happening for years without requiring overnight accommodations. But Sarah needed to believe her husband's absence was temporary and practical, rather than permanent and personal. I stopped correcting her gentle lies. What was the point? She was protecting herself the same way I'd protected myself during the worst years of my marriage to David, by creating reasonable explanations for unreasonable behavior, by finding logic in choices that were purely emotional. But watching Sarah rationalize Marcus's withdrawal was like looking into a mirror that showed me 35 years younger, holding a different baby, making different excuses for the same basic abandonment. "He brought home flowers last night," Sarah said with the desperate brightness of someone clutching at evidence of love. "Just because. No special occasion. That's nice. And he's been working on Emma's college fund. He set up this investment account that automatically transfers money every month." She adjusted Emma's blanket with unnecessary precision. "He's thinking about her future, planning ahead." I wanted to tell her that love wasn't a financial transaction. That presence mattered more than planning. That connection couldn't be replaced by contribution. But she wasn't ready to hear those truths yet. Instead, I focused on Emma. At 2 months old, she was becoming more interactive, more present in the world. Her eyes tracked movement with sharp intelligence, and she'd begun making small sounds that weren't quite words, but felt like conversation attempts. "Look at you, sweet girl," I whispered during her afternoon feeding, watching her tiny fingers curl around my thumb. "You're getting so strong." She was gaining weight steadily, responding well to her treatments, exceeding her doctor's cautious expectations. Whatever challenges cystic fibrosis would bring to her life, she was facing them with remarkable resilience. "The pulmonologist says her lung function tests are actually above average," Sarah said, settling beside us on the couch. "She might not need as intensive a treatment schedule as they initially thought." That's wonderful news. I keep hoping Marcus will see that too, that maybe if her prognosis improves, if she becomes less medically complex. She didn't finish the sentence, but I heard what she wasn't saying. Maybe if Emma became easier, less expensive, more convenient, Marcus would remember how to love his daughter. But I'd learned something during my own years of hoping David would soften, would connect, would choose family over the safety of emotional distance. People didn't change because circumstances improved. They changed because they decided to change, usually after facing consequences that made their current choices unsustainable. And Marcus was sustaining his choices just fine. One evening, I arrived to find Sarah sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread around her like fallen leaves. Emma was sleeping in her carrier beside her, the soft sound of her breathing mixing with the hum of the refrigerator. "What's all this?" I asked, noting the official letterhead on several documents. "Insurance papers, medical bills, appointment schedules." Sarah rubbed her temples with both hands. "I'm trying to organize everything for tax purposes. Marcus says we might be able to claim some deductions if I document everything properly." The papers told the story of Emma's short life in medical terminology and billing codes, specialist consultations, equipment rentals, prescription costs that would make most families reconsider having children at all. "This is a lot to manage," I said, scanning the neat piles Sarah had created. "Marcus used to help with paperwork, but lately," she gestured vaguely toward his closed office door, "he says he trusts me to handle the details." Translation: he delegated his daughter's medical care to his wife so completely that he no longer knew which doctors she saw or what treatments she received. He was funding Emma's health care while remaining completely disconnected from Emma's health. "Sarah, when was the last time Marcus came to one of Emma's appointments?" She was quiet for so long I thought she wasn't going to answer. "The diagnosis appointment," she said finally. "At the hospital. He hasn't been to any follow-ups. 2 months of pediatric visits, specialist consultations, and treatment adjustments, all handled by a woman who was learning to navigate complex medical systems while grieving the loss of her partner's emotional support. What does he say when you ask him to come?" I stopped asking. The admission came out quietly, almost ashamed. "He always has conflicts. Important meetings, crucial deadlines, client emergencies that can't wait. It's easier to just handle it myself than to deal with the disappointment." I recognized that resignation. The moment when you stop fighting for what you need because the fight itself becomes more exhausting than the original problem. That night, I went home to my empty house and sat in the chair where I'd rocked Marcus through countless childhood illnesses, injuries, and nightmares. The same chair where I'd held him during his struggles with reading, when other children called him stupid and his father looked at report cards with visible disappointment. I'd protected Marcus from David's judgment then, made excuses for his father's distance, convinced myself that David just didn't know how to handle difficulty. I'd told Marcus that Daddy loved him, but had trouble showing it, that work stress made Daddy seem angry when he was really just worried. All those gentle lies designed to protect a child from the truth that his father found him inconvenient. Now Marcus was using the same emotional script with his own daughter, and I was watching Sarah tell herself the same protective stories I'd once embraced. But this time was different. This time I wasn't a young wife hoping her husband would change if she just tried harder, loved better, asked for less. This time I was a grandmother who'd learned that some patterns repeat until someone has the courage to break them. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through old messages from Marcus, looking for evidence of the man I'd raised, photos from Emma's birth, when his smile had seemed genuine, texts about baby gear and nursery furniture, when he'd seemed invested in preparing for fatherhood. "She's perfect," he'd written on the day Emma was born. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and Sarah's eyes. That was before the diagnosis, before perfection became complicated, before love required more effort than he was prepared to invest. I kept scrolling until I found what I was looking for. A text I'd saved but never mentioned to anyone. A message Marcus had sent during Sarah's pregnancy, when they'd thought they were getting the easy version of parenthood. "I want to be the kind of father mine never was. Present, involved, proud. I want her to know she's wanted." I stared at those words for a long time, remembering the young man who'd written them, the same man who'd struggled through learning disabilities with determination, who'd worked 2 jobs to pay for college, who'd built a successful career through sheer persistence when others had written him off. That Marcus still existed somewhere inside the man who was currently using work as armor against his own daughter's needs. The question was whether I had the courage to do what I should have done 35 years ago, when David started pulling away from his own difficult child. I walked to my bedroom closet and pushed aside hanging clothes to reach the small box I kept on the highest shelf. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, was something I'd saved for over 3 decades. Something I'd never shown David, never mentioned to Marcus, never spoken about to anyone. But they didn't know what I had kept all along. The box contained a letter I'd written but never sent, dated 35 years ago when Marcus was 3 years old and struggling with what we now know was dyslexia. The paper was cream-colored, expensive, the kind I'd bought for special occasions back when I believed words on beautiful stationery might carry more weight than desperate pleas on notebook paper. "Dear David," it began in my younger self's careful handwriting, "I need you to see what you're doing to our son." I'd written it after another evening of watching David's frustration build as Marcus struggled with simple picture books, his little finger moving slowly under words that seemed to shift and dance before his eyes. David would start patient, but grow increasingly tense as minutes stretched into battles over basic sentences. "He's not stupid," the letter continued. "He's different. And different doesn't mean damaged or disappointing or less worthy of your love." I remembered writing those words at this same kitchen table after Marcus had gone to bed in tears, convinced he was stupid, because Daddy got angry every time they tried to read together. I'd poured my heart onto that paper, explaining how David's impatience was damaging our son's confidence, how Marcus had begun flinching when his father approached with a book. "Love isn't supposed to be conditional on performance," I'd written. "Children aren't supposed to earn their parents' affection by being easy." The letter was 3 pages long, full of observations about Marcus's strengths, his creativity, his determination. I'd documented specific incidents where David's criticism had reduced our little boy to tears, moments when encouragement might have built confidence instead of crushing it. I'd sealed it in an envelope and carried it in my purse for weeks, waiting for the right moment to give it to David, the moment when he'd be receptive, calm, open to hearing that his approach was hurting the child we both loved. That moment never came. Every time I thought about handing him the letter, David would do something kind, bring home Marcus's favorite ice cream, help with a difficult homework assignment, praise a drawing Marcus had made. These small gestures convinced me that maybe he was changing on his own, that maybe my letter wasn't necessary after all, so I kept waiting, and waiting, until the letter became a relic of hope rather than a tool for change, buried in a box with other artifacts from the woman I'd been before I learned that keeping peace was easier than demanding justice. Now, holding that yellowed paper in my 70-year-old hands, I could see the pattern clearly. I'd spent decades protecting the feelings of men who couldn't handle the emotions of the children depending on them. I'd made excuses, created explanations, smoothed over damage instead of preventing it in the first place. With David, I'd convinced myself that patience would eventually teach him to love his son unconditionally. With Marcus, I was watching Sarah make the same mistake. But this time, I wasn't a young wife afraid of disrupting a marriage I couldn't afford to lose. This time, I was a grandmother whose only obligation was to protect a baby who couldn't protect herself. The next morning, I called Sarah. "How are you doing, honey?" There was a long pause. "I'm tired, Margaret. Really, really tired." The admission hit me like a physical blow. Sarah never complained, never asked for help directly, never admitted that the weight of single-handedly managing Emma's care was crushing her spirit one sleepless night at a time. "What can I do?" "Nothing. Everything. I don't know." Her voice cracked. "Emma had a rough night. Her breathing was labored, and I couldn't tell if it was normal CF stuff or something that required emergency attention. I called the on-call nurse 3 times. What did Marcus do?" Silence stretched between us, and I knew the answer before she spoke. "He has that big presentation today, the Singapore deal. He needed his sleep, and Emma needed her father." "Margaret." Sarah's voice carried a warning, a plea not to force her to acknowledge what they both knew. "I'm coming over." "You don't have to." "I'm coming over," I repeated, gentler but firm. "And we're going to talk, really talk, about what's happening and what we're going to do about it." An hour later, I sat in Sarah's living room holding Emma while her mother finally let herself say the words she'd been avoiding for months. "He doesn't love her," Sarah whispered, the admission torn from somewhere deep inside her chest. "He looks at her like she's a problem he's trying to solve instead of a person he's supposed to cherish." "I know. Last night, when she was struggling to breathe, I asked him to hold her while I prepared her nebulizer treatment. He said he needed to review his presentation notes, that I was better at calming her down anyway. Tears slipped down Sarah's cheeks. She's 10 weeks old, Margaret. She doesn't understand why Daddy doesn't want to comfort her when she's scared. Emma stirred in my arms, her tiny face scrunching with the particular expression that meant she was waking up ready to engage with the world. At 10 weeks, she was already showing personality. Alert, curious, responsive to voices and faces in ways that made it impossible to see her as anything other than a complete person deserving unconditional love. "What are you going to do?" I asked Sarah gently. "I don't know. Part of me keeps hoping he'll come around, that something will click and he'll remember how excited he was during the pregnancy. But another part of me," she trailed off, unwilling to voice thoughts that felt like betrayal. "What does that part say?" "That part says Emma and I might be better off without him. That the stress of pretending we're a happy family is worse than the honesty of admitting we're not." It wasn't pain anymore. It was clarity. I understood something about myself in that moment, holding my granddaughter while her mother considered impossible choices. I'd spent my marriage believing that holding families together was always the right choice, that love could overcome any obstacle if you just tried hard enough. But I'd been wrong. Sometimes love meant protecting children from adults who couldn't or wouldn't rise to the occasion of parenthood. Sometimes holding families together meant enabling patterns of damage that would echo through generations. "Sarah," I said carefully, "what would you need to make it on your own?" The question hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure either of us was ready to cross. "Everything," she said with a shaky laugh. "Financial support, childcare help, a place to live that's accessible for Emma's medical equipment, a job that offers health insurance and flexibility for doctor appointments. Basically, I'd need a miracle. Or you'd need people who believe you and Emma deserve better." She looked at me with something between hope and terror. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you don't have to do this alone. I'm saying there are options you haven't considered because you've been trying to save a marriage that might not be worth saving." Emma made a soft cooing sound, and both Sarah and I looked down at her perfect face. She was studying my features with the intense concentration babies bring to everything, as if she was memorizing details for future reference. "She trusts me," I said, watching Emma's eyes track my movements. "She doesn't know I'm old or inexperienced with modern baby care. She doesn't know about my arthritis or my limited income or any of the practical reasons I might not be the ideal person to help raise her. She just knows I hold her with love instead of obligation." "Margaret, I've been thinking about the early years with Marcus, about the choices I made and the ones I avoided, about the woman I was before I learned that keeping peace was more important than demanding justice." Sarah was listening with the attention of someone who sensed that everything was about to change. "I have some savings," I continued, the words coming from a place of certainty I hadn't accessed in decades. "Not much by some standards, but enough to help bridge the gap while you figure out your next steps. I have time, energy, and 35 years of experience loving a child who needed more than traditional parenting could provide." I'm talking about what Emma needs, what you need, what I need, if I'm being honest." I shifted the baby slightly, marveling at how natural it felt to hold her, to be responsible for her immediate comfort. "I spent Marcus's childhood trying to fix his father instead of protecting my son from his father's limitations. I won't make that mistake with Emma." For the first time in months, I saw real hope flicker across Sarah's face. "Marcus will never forgive you for taking his side over his. Marcus made his choice when he decided Emma was inconvenient rather than essential. Now I'm making mine." Emma yawned, a tiny sound that reminded us both how innocent she was in all this adult drama. She didn't know her father found her expensive or complicated. She didn't understand that her diagnosis had disappointed people who were supposed to celebrate her existence regardless of circumstances. All she knew was that some arms held her with joy and others held her with duty, and she deserved to spend her childhood in the arms that chose joy. "What would it look like?" Sarah asked quietly. It would look like whatever we decided to make it look like. Maybe you and Emma living here with me until you get established. Maybe me moving closer to wherever you want to build your new life. Maybe something completely different that we haven't thought of yet." "And Marcus?" I thought about the letter I'd never sent, about 35 years of hoping men would choose connection over comfort, about the difference between enabling someone's limitations and protecting children from the consequences of those limitations. Marcus will always be Emma's father, I said finally. But he's forfeited his right to determine the terms of how she's loved. If he wants to be part of her life, he'll need to prove he can prioritize her well-being over his convenience. Sarah nodded slowly, and I could see her beginning to imagine possibilities she'd been afraid to consider. It won't be easy, I warned her. Nothing about this has been easy, she replied. But at least this way, Emma would grow up knowing she's wanted. In my arms, Emma made another soft sound, and I realized she was looking directly at me with the clear-eyed gaze of someone who understood, on some primal level, that her world was about to change. For the better. Sarah moved in with me on a Tuesday morning when Marcus was in Chicago for a 3-day business conference. We'd planned it carefully, quietly, with the methodical precision of women who'd learned that sometimes survival required strategy rather than confrontation. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked for the dozenth time as we loaded Emma's medical equipment into my spare bedroom. The nebulizer, the chest percussion vest, the specialized monitors that tracked her breathing patterns through the night. Each piece of equipment represented months of insurance negotiations and medical consultations that Marcus had delegated entirely to his wife. "I'm sure." I adjusted the portable crib we'd positioned near the window where morning light would reach Emma's face gently. This room was always meant for a baby. It just took me 70 years to find the right one. Emma was napping in her carrier, exhausted from the morning's activities, but sleeping peacefully in that deep way healthy babies sleep when they feel safe. At 12 weeks old, she'd grown into her features, Sarah's delicate bone structure but with an alertness that seemed distinctly her own. The doctors were cautiously optimistic about her response to treatment. Her weight gain was steady, her lung function stable, her overall development ahead of schedule. "She's thriving," the pediatric pulmonologist had told Sarah during last week's appointment. "Some CF babies struggle much more in their first year. Emma seems to be responding exceptionally well to her treatment regimen." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Emma was exceeding medical expectations while her father was failing to meet the most basic emotional ones. Sarah arranged Emma's medications in my kitchen cabinet with pharmaceutical precision, each bottle labeled with dosage instructions and timing requirements. Watching her organize our new routine, I was struck by how competent she'd become in managing complex medical care while grieving the loss of her marriage. "The visiting nurse comes Tuesdays and Fridays," she said, placing the chest therapy vest in its designated spot. "She's wonderful with Emma, and she's been teaching me advanced techniques for when Emma gets older." "What about Marcus's work schedule? When will he notice you're not there?" Sarah's hands stilled for a moment. "He's been staying at the downtown office more often lately. Sometimes he doesn't come home for 2 or 3 days. Her voice was carefully neutral. "I left a note explaining that we needed space to figure things out, that we'd be staying somewhere safe while we decided our next steps." I waited for her to continue, understanding that she needed to process this decision at her own pace. "I also left his lawyer's business card on the kitchen table," she said quietly. "The one who handled his partnership agreements. If he wants to discuss custody or support arrangements, he can call them to schedule a meeting." The practicality of her approach impressed me. No drama, no ultimatums, no emotional scenes that could be dismissed later as temporary hysteria. Just clear communication about changed circumstances and professional contacts for legal discussions. "How do you feel about it?" I asked. "Relieved," she said immediately, then looked surprised by her own honesty. "I've been holding my breath for months, waiting for him to remember how to love us. Walking on eggshells, making excuses, pretending everything was fine when it obviously wasn't." She moved to check on Emma, adjusting her blanket with the automatic precision of a mother whose attention was always half-focused on her child's needs. "Now I can just focus on what she needs without worrying about whether my choices will irritate him or disrupt his schedule." Sarah's voice grew stronger with each word. "I can take her to doctor appointments without apologizing for the inconvenience. I can do her breathing treatments without feeling like I need to be quiet so he can work. I can love her without constantly defending why she deserves that love." That afternoon, while Sarah rested and Emma napped, I called my attorney, the same woman who'd handled my divorce from David 5 years after Marcus graduated college. Patricia Chen was in her 60s now, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, with 3 decades of experience helping women navigate family law when traditional family structures failed. "Margaret, it's been a while," Patricia said when her assistant put me through. "How can I help you?" "I need advice about grandparents' rights." I said without preamble, and about protecting a baby whose father is neglecting his responsibilities. There was a pause that felt loaded with professional assessment. Is this about Marcus? Patricia had handled my divorce, which meant she knew the family history. She understood that patterns of emotional abandonment sometimes repeated across generations, especially when they weren't interrupted by intervention. His daughter, Emma, she has cystic fibrosis and Marcus has essentially checked out of parenting. Sarah, his wife, has been managing everything alone, and she's considering leaving him. And you want to know what rights you'd have to maintain a relationship with your granddaughter if the marriage dissolves. I want to know what rights I'd have to protect her if her father continues to prioritize everything except her well-being. Another pause, longer this time. That's a more complicated question. Are we talking about documented neglect? Abuse? Specific incidents you could testify to in court? I thought about Marcus's systematic withdrawal, his delegation of all parental responsibilities to Sarah, his absence from medical appointments, his obvious resentment toward a baby whose only crime was requiring more care than he'd bargained for. Emotional neglect, I said finally. Nothing dramatic enough for social services, but chronic enough to damage a child who grows up knowing her father sees her as a burden. I understand. Patricia's voice carried the weariness of someone who'd seen too many variations of this story. Emotional neglect is harder to prove than physical abuse, but it's not impossible. Especially when there's medical documentation of a child's special needs and evidence that one parent is bearing all responsibility while the other parent avoids involvement. What would that look like practically? Medical records showing only one parent present for appointments, documentation of the child's care routine showing unequal distribution of responsibilities, testimony from healthcare providers about which parent asks questions, shows concern, demonstrates knowledge of the child's condition. I realized that Marcus had been creating his own legal case against himself through months of documented absence. There's something else, I said. Sarah and Emma are staying with me now. Sarah left Marcus a note explaining they need space to figure things out. How long has this arrangement been in place? About 6 hours. Patricia's laugh was dry. Well, you don't waste time. Has Marcus responded to the note? He's out of town until Thursday. He doesn't know yet. When he finds out, he's going to be angry, possibly angry enough to do something legally foolish, which would actually work in your favor if this escalates to custody proceedings. Emma chose that moment to wake from her nap, her soft sounds carrying through the baby monitor Sarah had set up in my kitchen. I could hear Sarah moving around upstairs, preparing for the afternoon breathing treatment that had become as routine as feeding time. Patricia, what I need to know is this. If Marcus tries to use his financial resources to force Sarah back into a situation that's harmful for Emma, what options do we have? Several, depending on how committed you are to this course of action. But Margaret, I need you to understand something important. Once you enter a legal battle over a child's custody, especially against your own son, there's no going back. Families don't recover from these kinds of conflicts. I listened to the sounds upstairs. Sarah's gentle voice talking to Emma through the breathing treatment. Emma's contented responses. The quiet efficiency of a mother who'd learned to provide complex medical care with love rather than resentment. Some families are already broken, I said. Sometimes the choice isn't between keeping peace and making war. Sometimes it's between enabling damage and preventing it. All right then, let me outline your options. We talked for another 20 minutes about legal strategies, documentation requirements, and the realities of pursuing grandparents' rights in cases where biological parents were living but inadequately involved. Patricia was thorough, honest about both the possibilities and limitations of legal intervention in family situations. The good news, she concluded, is that courts increasingly recognize that a child's best interests aren't always served by keeping biological families intact at any cost. Judges understand that sometimes extended family members provide stability that parents can't or won't provide. And the bad news? The bad news is that Marcus has parental rights that won't be easily terminated. Even if you win temporary custody or significant visitation rights, he'll always be Emma's legal father with all the authority that entails. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen listening to the sounds of new life filling my house. Sarah humming while she organized Emma's evening medications. Emma making the small vocalizations that meant she was alert and content. The soft mechanical sound of medical equipment that was keeping my granddaughter healthy and strong. For the first time in months, my house felt like a home rather than a museum of memories. That evening, Marcus called Sarah's phone. I was feeding Emma her bottle while Sarah took a long overdue shower, so I answered. "Mom, why are you answering Sarah's phone? Where is she?" His voice carried the sharp edge of someone who'd discovered that the world hadn't waited for his permission to change. "Hello, Marcus. Sarah's taking a shower. Emma and I are having dinner." "Dinner? At your house? What's going on?" I looked down at Emma, who was watching my face with the focused attention she brought to everything interesting. Her eyes were bright and alert, tracking my expressions as if she was learning something important about the world through our interaction. "Sarah and Emma are staying with me for a while," I said calmly. "They needed a change of environment." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. "Mom, what the hell is happening? I came home to an empty house and a note about needing space. Sarah won't answer my calls. Maybe you should ask yourself why your wife and daughter felt the need to leave without talking to you first." "I need to talk to Sarah. Put her on the phone." "She's not available right now." "This is ridiculous. They're my wife and daughter. They belong at home, not at your house playing some kind of game." Emma had finished her bottle and was making soft sounds that meant she was ready to be burped and cuddled. I shifted her to my shoulder, marveling at how perfectly she fit against my chest. "Marcus," I said quietly, "when was the last time you held your daughter?" "What kind of question is that?" "A simple one. When did you last hold Emma just because you wanted to spend time with her?" Another long silence. "I've been working to provide for my family's future. Someone has to handle the financial reality of raising a special needs child. Someone has to handle the emotional reality too. Emma doesn't know about college funds or insurance policies. She only knows whether the people around her respond to her with love or obligation." "Are you lecturing me about being a father?" "I'm telling you that love isn't a financial transaction, and that your daughter deserves better than a father who sees her as an expensive inconvenience." The conversation ended abruptly when Marcus hung up, but something had shifted in the silence that followed. The storm was coming, but I was no longer afraid of it. Emma settled against my chest with complete trust, her breathing steady and strong. Whatever challenges the next few days brought, she would face them surrounded by people who chose to love her rather than resent her needs. That was worth whatever conflict was about to unfold. Marcus arrived at my house Thursday morning without calling first, his footsteps on the porch deliberate and heavy. Through the window, I watched him pause at the door, straightening his tie and checking his appearance in the glass. The automatic gestures of a man who'd learned to approach difficult conversations like business negotiations. Sarah was upstairs giving Emma her morning breathing treatment, the soft hum of the nebulizer mixing with her gentle voice as she talked Emma through the routine they'd developed together. The sound drifted down like a lullaby, filling my house with the kind of peaceful domesticity that had been missing from their marriage for months. When I opened the door, Marcus stood there in his expensive suit, briefcase in one hand and car keys in the other, looking like he'd come to collect assets rather than family members. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. "Good morning to you too, Marcus. Come in." He stepped inside but remained standing in my entryway, his posture rigid with barely contained frustration. I could see him cataloging details: Emma's portable crib visible through the living room doorway, medical equipment neatly organized on my kitchen counter, Sarah's jacket hanging on the coat hook like she belonged here. "This has gone far enough, Mom. Whatever point you think you're making, you've made it. It's time for Sarah and Emma to come home. Have you asked them what they want?" "I don't need to ask. They're my family. They belong with me." The possessive certainty in his voice reminded me sharply of his father. The same assumption that family members existed to serve his convenience, rather than pursuing their own well-being. "Sit down, Marcus." "I don't need to sit down. I need my wife and daughter to come home so we can discuss this situation like adults instead of playing games." "The only person playing games is you." I moved toward the living room, forcing him to either follow me or continue the conversation, shouting across my house. "You've been playing house for months while Sarah raised your daughter alone." He followed reluctantly, but remained standing while I settled into my favorite chair, the same one where I'd rocked him through childhood nightmares and homework struggles. "I've been working," he said, his voice rising slightly, "providing for their future, building financial security for a child who's going to need expensive medical care for the rest of her life." "When was the last time you changed Emma's diaper?" The question caught him off guard. "What does that have to do with anything? When was the last time you fed her? Did her breathing treatment?" took her to a doctor's appointment. When was the last time you held your daughter without being asked? Sarah handles those things. She's better at them. I'm Sarah handles them because you won't. There's a difference. Marcus finally sat down, but perched on the edge of the couch like he was ready to leave at any moment. Mom, I don't understand what you expect from me. I work 60 hours a week to pay for Emma's medical care. I've taken on additional clients to build her college fund. I've researched the best specialists in the country and made sure our insurance covers experimental treatments. How is that not being a good father? Because fatherhood isn't a financial transaction. Easy words from someone who's never had to worry about paying for a chronically ill child's care. The accusation hung in the air between us, sharp enough to cut. He was using Emma's diagnosis as a shield, hiding his emotional withdrawal behind legitimate concerns about medical costs. From upstairs, we could hear Sarah's voice, soft and encouraging, talking Emma through the breathing treatment that had become as routine as breakfast. That's my good girl. You're doing so well. Mama's right here. Listen to that, I said quietly. Listen to what? Love, patience, connection, the sound of a mother who sees her child as a person rather than a problem. Marcus's jaw tightened. Are you implying that I don't love my daughter? I'm stating directly that you've spent more energy avoiding her than caring for her. That's not true. When was the last time you were alone with Emma for more than 10 minutes? Silence. When was the last time you knew her feeding schedule without asking Sarah? More silence. When was the last time you looked at your daughter and saw something other than medical bills and lost opportunities? Stop. His voice carried a warning, but underneath the anger, I heard something else. The sound of a man who knew he was being confronted with truths he couldn't deny. Sarah's footsteps on the stairs interrupted the tension. She appeared in the living room doorway holding Emma, who was bright-eyed and alert after her treatment, ready to engage with whatever interesting things the day might offer. Marcus, Sarah said quietly, I got your messages. Sarah, this is ridiculous. Whatever my mother has told you, whatever she's convinced you to think, we can work through it, but not like this. Not by running away and involving outside parties in our marriage. Emma made a soft cooing sound, reaching toward the light streaming through my living room window. At 3 months old, she was becoming more interactive, more present in the world, responding to voices and faces with clear recognition and preference. She's beautiful, I said, watching Emma track the movement of dust motes in the sunlight. Look how alert she is, how responsive. Marcus glanced at his daughter briefly, but his attention immediately returned to Sarah. We have appointments to discuss this properly. I've scheduled time with a marriage counselor for Monday afternoon. You scheduled appointments without asking if I was available, Sarah said. You're available. I checked your calendar. The casual assumption that he could manage her time without consultation revealed everything about how he saw their relationship. Sarah was an employee whose schedule he could manipulate, rather than a partner whose input mattered. What if I don't want marriage counseling? Sarah asked. Of course you want counseling. We both want to save our marriage. Do we? The question was so quiet it almost disappeared into the morning air, but it carried enough weight to shift something fundamental in the room's atmosphere. Marcus stared at his wife as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. What kind of question is that? The kind that's been keeping me awake at night for months, Sarah said, settling into the chair beside mine. Emma immediately reached for me, and Sarah transferred her over with the easy coordination of women who'd learned to share childcare responsibilities. Sarah, you're tired. You're overwhelmed. New mothers often feel, don't. Her voice carried a steel I'd never heard before. Don't tell me what I feel. Don't diagnose my emotions or explain away my concerns as hormones or exhaustion. Marcus looked genuinely surprised by her directness. I'm trying to help. You want to help? Tell me about Emma's medication schedule. What? Her medications. What does she take? When does she take it? And why? Sarah, I don't see how. Tell me about her last doctor's appointment. What did the pulmonologist say? What were her weight and height percentiles? What adjustments did they make to her treatment plan? Marcus's face was flushing with frustration. You handle the medical details. We agreed that was the most efficient division of responsibilities. We didn't agree to anything. You delegated everything and convinced yourself that delegation was partnership. Emma was studying my face with the intense focus she brought to everything interesting, her tiny fingers gripping my thumb with surprising strength. She had no idea she was at the center of an adult conversation that would determine the trajectory of her entire childhood. "I work to support this family," Marcus said, his voice rising. "I've increased our income by 30% this year to cover Emma's care costs. I've researched insurance policies and treatment centers and college savings plans. How is that not involved parenting?" "Because Emma doesn't know about college savings plans," I said quietly. "She knows whether Daddy's arms feel safe or whether they feel like duty. That's ridiculous sentimental. When she cries at night, who comforts her? Sarah. When she needs her medication, who gives it to her? Sarah, but when she has doctor's appointments, who takes her? Sarah handles those things because she's available during the day. And when you're available in the evening, where are you?" Marcus stood abruptly, pacing toward the window with the restless energy of someone who felt cornered. "This is insane. You're both acting like providing for my family is some kind of crime." "Providing is important," Sarah said. "But Emma needs more than financial support. She needs a father who can hold her without checking his phone. She needs a parent who knows her medical routine not because he memorized it for this conversation, but because he participates in it daily. I participate by making sure she has access to the best possible care." "When was the last time you did her chest therapy?" Silence. "When was the last time you gave her a breathing treatment?" More silence. "When was the last time you held her while she was crying and actually managed to comfort her instead of handing her to me?" The silence stretched so long that Emma began to fuss, sensing the tension in the room even though she couldn't understand its source. I stood and walked toward the window where Marcus stood. Emma settled peacefully in my arms. "Look at her," I said softly. "I am looking at her. Really look. See her face, not your fear about her future. See her personality, not her diagnosis. See your daughter, not your burden." For a moment, something shifted in Marcus's expression. He looked at Emma, really looked at her, and I saw the flicker of recognition that should have been there from the beginning. Wonder, pride, love uncomplicated by resentment. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the familiar mask of practical concern. "She's going to need so much," he said quietly. "Specialists, equipment, modifications to wherever we live, special schools probably, constant monitoring, a lifetime of being different. She's going to need love," Sarah said from across the room. "Everything else is manageable if she grows up knowing she's wanted exactly as she is. And if I can't give her that?" The question came out raw, honest, more vulnerable than anything he'd said since Emma's diagnosis. "What if I look at her and all I can think about is how much harder everything is going to be?" The admission hung in the air like a confession, finally naming the truth we'd all been dancing around for months. I walked back toward him, still holding Emma, who was now dozing against my shoulder with the complete trust that babies show when they feel absolutely safe. "Then you let people who can love her unconditionally take care of her until you figure out how to be the father she deserves," I said quietly. "You don't pretend to be present while emotionally checking out. You don't make Sarah carry the weight of parenting alone while you hide behind work obligations. And if I never figure it out, then you let her go." The words tasted bitter, but they were true. Because children deserve better than parents who see them as obligations rather than gifts. Marcus stared at me for a long moment, and I saw him processing the choice I was offering him: fight for his daughter, or release her to people who would fight for her instead. What I didn't expect was for him to choose a third option. "Fine," he said, his voice cold with decision. "If that's how you all feel, if Emma is better off without me, then that's what she'll get." He turned toward the door without kissing his daughter goodbye, without trying to comfort his wife, without acknowledging that he was about to walk away from the most important responsibilities of his life. "Marcus," Sarah called after him, "my lawyer will be in touch about custody arrangements," he said without turning around. "Since everyone seems to think I'm such a terrible father, we'll make it official." The door closed behind him with quiet finality, leaving the three of us in a silence that felt both devastating and relieving. Emma stirred in my arms but didn't wake, her breathing steady and peaceful despite the chaos surrounding her young life. "Did we just break up a family?" Sarah asked, tears starting to fall. "No," I said, holding my granddaughter closer. "We just stopped pretending that good intentions and financial support were the same thing as love." For the first time in months, my house felt completely peaceful. 6 months later, I woke to the sound of Emma laughing in her high chair while Sarah made breakfast in my kitchen. The morning light streamed through windows I'd kept closed for too many years, illuminating a house that had transformed from a museum of memories into a home filled with purpose. "Someone's in a good mood this morning," Sarah said, wiping applesauce from Emma's chin. At 9 months old, Emma was sitting confidently, reaching for everything within her grasp, and responding to her name with bright smiles that lit up every room she entered. "She slept through the night again," I said, settling beside them with my coffee. "That's 4 nights in a row. The new routine is working." Sarah's voice carried the satisfaction of a mother who'd found her rhythm. "Dr. Martinez thinks we might be able to reduce her breathing treatments to twice daily soon." Emma babbled something that sounded almost like conversation, her eyes bright and engaged as she tracked movements around the kitchen. Her latest obsession was trying to feed herself, a messy endeavor that resulted in more food on her face than in her mouth, but one that demonstrated her determination to master new skills. "Look at you, independent girl," I said, watching her grip a piece of soft banana with fierce concentration. "You know exactly what you want." The physical transformation in Emma was remarkable, but the emotional transformation in Sarah was equally striking. Gone were the dark circles under her eyes, the constant anxiety about managing medical care alone, the exhausted resignation of someone carrying too much weight. She'd found part-time work doing graphic design from home, flexible enough to accommodate Emma's medical schedule, but engaging enough to remind her that she had talents beyond childcare. "Marcus called yesterday," Sarah said quietly, not meeting my eyes. I felt my chest tighten with familiar protective instincts. "What did he want?" "To see Emma. He says his therapist thinks it would be beneficial for both of them if he started building a relationship with her." Marcus had been notably absent since walking out of my living room 6 months ago. His lawyer had handled all communication about financial support, generous child support payments that arrived punctually, but without personal notes or requests for visitation. He'd been funding Emma's care while maintaining complete emotional distance, treating fatherhood like a subscription service he could maintain without active participation. "What do you think?" I asked carefully. Sarah lifted Emma from her high chair, settling her on her lap where she immediately reached for Sarah's necklace with grabby fingers. "I think part of me has been hoping he'd figure out how to be her father, and part of me is terrified that he'll show up, disrupt our peace, and then disappear again when things get complicated. Those are both reasonable feelings. The thing is," Sarah continued, adjusting Emma to face outward so she could see the kitchen activity, "Emma doesn't know she's supposed to miss having a father. She's happy, healthy, thriving. She has 2 people who adore her unconditionally, and she's never experienced the confusion of being treated like a burden." Emma made a delighted sound as our cat wandered through the kitchen, her eyes following his movement with fascination. She'd recently discovered that pointing resulted in adult attention directed toward whatever interested her, a powerful realization for someone who was just beginning to understand cause and effect. "What did you tell him?" "That he's welcome to visit, but that Emma's routine and well-being come first. That he can't treat her like a weekend hobby he picks up when it's convenient." Sarah's voice was steady, confident in a way that would have been impossible 6 months ago. "And that if he wants to be part of her life, he needs to be prepared to love her as she is, not as he wishes she were." The doorbell interrupted our conversation, and I felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. We weren't expecting anyone, and unexpected visitors had become cause for concern since Marcus's departure. Through the front window, I saw a familiar figure, Patricia Chen, my attorney, holding what appeared to be an official envelope. "I'll get it," I said, lifting Emma from Sarah's arms. She came willingly, settling against my hip with the easy comfort of someone who'd learned that my arms were always safe. "Patricia," I said, opening the door, "this is a surprise." "Good morning, Margaret. I hope you don't mind me stopping by, but I thought you'd want to see this immediately." She held up the envelope with the expression of someone bearing good news. "Come in. Sarah's in the kitchen." We gathered around the kitchen table where Patricia spread out documents with the careful ceremony of someone presenting long-awaited victory. "Marcus's lawyer contacted me yesterday," she began. "Apparently, Marcus has been in therapy for several months, working through his feelings about Emma's diagnosis and his own fears about fatherhood." Sarah and I exchanged glances. This was the first either of us had heard about therapy. According to his therapist's recommendation, Marcus has decided to relinquish his parental rights voluntarily. The words hung in the air like something too good to be true. I felt Sarah go very still beside me, What does that mean, practically? Sarah asked. It means he's legally terminating his status as Emma's father. No custody rights, no visitation rights, no authority to make decisions about her care or education. Patricia's voice was professionally neutral, but I could see approval in her eyes. It also means no child support obligations, though he's indicated he wants to continue making voluntary payments for Emma's medical expenses. Why? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Patricia consulted her notes. His statement says, and I quote, "Emma deserves a father who can love her without reservation. I cannot provide that, but I can ensure she's raised by people who can." Emma chose that moment to babble something that sounded remarkably like "mama," reaching for Sarah with both arms. Sarah took her automatically, holding her close while processing information that would fundamentally change their lives. "There's more," Patricia continued. "He's also agreed to a formal adoption arrangement. If you want, Margaret, you can legally adopt Emma as her second parent. You'd have the same rights and responsibilities as Sarah, and Emma would be legally protected if anything happens to either of you." I looked at this baby who'd brought such purpose back into my life, who trusted me completely, who'd never known a day when she wasn't wanted exactly as she was. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "Absolutely yes." Sarah was crying now, but these were tears of relief rather than grief. "She'll never have to wonder why her father didn't fight for her," she said softly. "She'll never have to make excuses for someone who couldn't love her completely." Emma, sensing her mother's emotion, reached up to pat Sarah's face with gentle curiosity. At 9 months old, she was already demonstrating the empathy that children develop when they're raised in environments where emotions are acknowledged and validated, rather than suppressed or dismissed. "There's one more thing," Patricia said, pulling out a final document. "A letter from Marcus. For you, Margaret." I took the envelope with hands that weren't quite steady, recognizing Marcus's careful handwriting on expensive stationery, the same kind I'd once used for a letter I never sent. "Should I read it now? That's up to you." I opened the envelope carefully, aware that Sarah was watching my face for clues about its contents. "Dear Mom," it began, "I know you probably think I'm taking the easy way out, and maybe I am, but watching you and Sarah love Emma the way she deserves has made me realize something I should have understood months ago. Love isn't something you have to work at when it's real. It should feel natural, instinctive, protective. It should make you want to be better rather than making you resentful of having to try. I don't know why I can't love her the way a father should. Maybe it's because Dad never modeled unconditional love for me. Maybe it's because I'm too selfish to put someone else's needs before my convenience. Maybe it's because I'm just not built for the kind of sacrifice that real parenthood requires. What I do know is that Emma is extraordinary. She's strong, alert, beautiful, and completely innocent of any responsibility for my failings as her father. She deserves to grow up feeling wanted and celebrated, not tolerated and managed. You and Sarah can give her that. I can't, and pretending otherwise would only hurt all of us more than I already have. I'm sorry it took me so long to realize that stepping away was the kindest thing I could do for my daughter. I'm sorry I wasn't the father you raised me to be, or the man you deserved to have as a son. Take care of her. Take care of each other. Emma is lucky to have you both. Love, Marcus. P.S. I found the letter you wrote Dad when I was little, the one about him needing to love me without reservation. It was in his papers after he died. You were right then, and you're right now. Some people shouldn't be parents until they learn how to love without conditions. I'm still learning. I folded the letter carefully, my throat too tight for immediate speech. After 35 years, Marcus had found the letter I'd been too afraid to send. Words that might have saved both of us decades of pain if I'd had the courage to deliver them when they could have made a difference. "He found your letter?" Sarah asked gently. "The one I wrote but never sent, about David needing to love Marcus unconditionally." I looked at Emma, who was playing with Sarah's hair with intense concentration. "I've spent decades wondering what would have happened if I'd been brave enough to fight for my son the way we're fighting for Emma." "You're fighting for her now," Sarah said. "That's what matters." The paperwork took 3 weeks to finalize. 3 weeks of legal procedures that transformed our makeshift family into an official one, complete with court orders and revised birth certificates and adoption decrees that made everything permanent. On the day the adoption became official, we celebrated quietly, just the 3 of us in my backyard, where where I'd planted a small garden that Emma could explore once she was walking. She was already pulling herself up on furniture, demonstrating the determination that seemed to characterize everything she approached. "To Emma," Sarah said, raising a glass of sparkling cider, while Emma gnawed contentedly on a teething ring. "Who taught us that family isn't about biology? It's about choosing to love someone completely, even when it's inconvenient. To second chances," I added, "and to breaking patterns that needed to be broken." Emma looked between us with the bright curiosity that had become her trademark, as if she understood that this moment was significant even if she couldn't grasp its full meaning. That evening, after Sarah had put Emma to bed and gone upstairs to finish some design work, I sat in my living room reading the book Marcus had sent the previous week, a collection of letters from parents to their children, including an introduction he'd written about the importance of choosing love over fear. It was good work, honest and vulnerable in ways that suggested genuine growth rather than performative emotion. He'd found his way to parenthood after all, just not in the traditional configuration anyone had expected. The house was quiet except for the soft sound of Emma's breathing through the baby monitor and the occasional creak of settling wood. But it wasn't the hollow quiet of loneliness I'd grown accustomed to before Emma arrived. This was the peaceful silence of a home where people were safe and loved, and free to become whoever they were meant to be. I thought about the letter I'd written 35 years ago, about the courage that comes too late to change the past, but just in time to protect the future. About the difference between keeping peace and fighting for what children need to thrive. Sometimes the most important battles happen in living rooms rather than courtrooms, fought with gentle questions rather than dramatic confrontations. Sometimes victory looks like a baby sleeping peacefully because she's never had to doubt whether she's wanted. Sometimes silence is the loudest truth, not the silence of things left unsaid, but the silence of a heart finally at peace with the choices that matter most. Emma stirred through the monitor, making the soft sounds that meant she was dreaming, and I realized that some stories don't end with dramatic reconciliation or sudden transformation. Sometimes they end with a baby who will grow up knowing she was fought for, chosen, and loved without reservation by people who understood that family is something you build rather than something you inherit. That was enough. That was everything.